having a bit of a gas bag the other day with a mate of mine, Nick Moreldo, about sharpening. Now Nick is an extremely skilled woodworker and I'd love to do like a show and tell with him one day, but him being in the US makes that a little bit difficult. And we're talking about sharpening. Now Nick had just come back from a class he was teaching. I think it was on general woodworking, nothing as specific as sharpening, but he wanted to impart on me the importance of sharp and the unimportance of sharpening itself. Now what I mean by that is that having your tools sharp, chisels, saws, planes, what have you, is incredibly important. You can't do good work with dull tools. However, how you get there doesn't matter in the slightest. It doesn't matter if you use Waterstones, sandpaper, oil stones, diamond stones, power tools, it doesn't matter. Sharp is the only thing that matters. The point that Nick was making is that print magazines and YouTube and all those sorts of things really hype up specific types of sharpening. You know, scary sharp is the greatest ever. Wait, no, now there's diamond stones, they're even better. Here's a Tormek, whatever. It doesn't matter how you get to sharp. Sharpening should be something that's just really second nature. There's no, well, I'm not going to say there's no wrong ways, but there are so many right ways to sharpen that it just doesn't matter. It's not a hill worth dying on. The equivalent is saying that here is my top 10 tips for how you can correctly put on earmuffs and how you're doing it wrong. This is the only one true way, when there are so many ways. So in this video, naturally, I'm going to show you how I sharpen and why it's the one true method that you should actually use. It would be somewhat prudent to discuss what sharp actually is before we go into the sharpening techniques. It doesn't really matter what tools you've got at your disposal if you don't know what you're actually aiming for. Basically, sharp is just two planes coming to a point, and that's the key. They have to come to a point. The closer we can get this to an actual point, the sharper it is really going to be. So when your chisel is dull, it might be rounded over, something like that, and that's just not very good for cutting. So when you buy a chisel new from the factory, it might be something like that. The other thing we want to achieve is a nice uniform surface. So let's say this is the bevel of our chisel or plane blade. We want this to be a nice straight line. If it is all, you know, crooked and serrated from using too coarse a grit or just not evenly sharpening it, maybe one half is sharpened and one half is not, it's going to be largely useless for trying to slice off shavings of wood. So as I said earlier, it doesn't really matter what you use to sharpen, they all are going to achieve the same results. That being said, I use Waterstones and a diamond stone for flattening. Why Waterstones? Sandpaper adds up if you're using the scary sharp method, as you just go through that very quickly. It's very consumable compared to a Waterstone. Waterstones will wear down over time, but it's much, much slower. Oil stones are pretty messy and I don't really want a whole bunch of oil in the workshop. And then that really just leaves diamond stones. Diamond stones are interesting. One of the downsides of Waterstones is that you have to flatten them. And conversely, one of the upsides of diamond stones is you don't have to flatten them. One of the downsides, however, is if they're not flat and you don't realize, you cannot flatten them. The first sharpening kit I had actually had diamond stones in it that weren't flat, so I was having a real trouble trying to sharpen things when I was putting a curve on it and ruining my edge on every part. Though there's no real standard between different brands and the actual grit, diamond stones seem to be particularly bad at that. I initially had Easy Lap diamond stones and their fine was 1200 grit, which is not particularly fine, and that's what I consider my relatively coarse stone at the moment. For making an easy comparison, DMT, for example, do list the micron size of their diamond stones. The extra fine, the D8EE, is the equivalent of 3 micron, or it uses 3 micron abrasives on it, which is about the equivalent of a 4000 grit Waterstone. That has a lot more meaning comparatively than extra fine or super duper extra fine or medium coarse fine or whatever other terminology the brands want to use. Okay, so I use Waterstones, but what do I more specifically use? I'll start with the diamond stone, which is not a Waterstone, but I use this for flattening my Waterstones and very rough work, like when I get a new chisel or get significant damage on it but don't want to go to the grinder. This is 400 grit and I use it for flattening, and I affectionately call it my diamond trowel because it looks like a trowel. My main stone is this Serax combo stone, which is 1000 grit on one side, 6000 grit on the other. And very occasionally I use this King Waterstone, which I was gifted. That works fine. It's a splash and go style one. This one needs a little bit of soaking. The Serax abrasives are actually pretty good. They're nice and fast, but they are a little on the soft side. I'd still recommend them. They're well priced, but if you want something a bit more durable in Waterstones, you'd want to go for something like a Sharpening. Now, perhaps the elephant in the room is that I use a honing guide for my sharpening. This gets back to me saying that it doesn't matter what methods you use for sharpening, so long as you achieve sharp. Now, I know a certain wood grandpa might disagree and say that you can't be a real woodworker if you use a honing guide, and certainly the wood grandpa may also tell you that you can't be a real woodworker if you use machines, but I also use machines. I find that the honing guide is fantastic because I have some issues with posture changes and looking down. I find that I get a little bit dizzy. This is super simple, it's super quick. I get a consistent bevel all the time, it's great. If you can freehand sharpen, do that, who cares? So what I'm looking for here is the grit coming off the stone, and eventually I'll get a bit of a burr forming on the backside here. I'm applying little to no pressure, I'm really just steering it, but I'm trying to apply even pressure to both sides so I'm not tilting it one way or the other. Now, depending on my mood, I'll also strop it. This is a piece of 24mm birch, could be anything, with some crubber just glued onto it. You can use PVA or hide glue, glue's great. Then that's just charged with some green compound. I do that maybe once every 6 months, is just put some fresh compound, scrape it off, put some fresh compound on. Few strokes, we're good to go. This will often get left out if I'm dovetailing or doing other chisely tasks, just to keep it away from the stones for as long as possible. I like the crubber because it's nice and firm. If you use too soft of a substrate for the aluminium oxide or whatever paste you're using, you will end up, again, rounding over your bevel, perhaps forming the wire on the other side. This crubber combination, it gives just enough flex, carries the compound well enough, but doesn't roll the edge all that easily. I don't like to go overboard because it's not really a lot of point. I've seen plenty of suggestions that you need to go as fast and as hard as possible, and honestly, that doesn't seem to make any difference for me, other than running the risk of stabbing into it or rounding the edge over and defeating the purpose of sharpening in the first place. So how do we know whether something is sharp enough? I could show you the bevel here and go, wow, look at how mirrored that surface is. Surely that's the sharpest thing in the world. And that means nothing. You can have a dull chisel that has a nice shiny bevel. Doesn't really mean anything. This happens to be shiny because it's been stropped, but that's about it. The real test is how it works on wood, and let's see if we can pair some end grain here. You can see the massive colour difference as we're cleanly slicing that wood. A nice, oh, I just cracked that. A nice long end grain shaving. That's how I know my chisel is sharp, is when it can pair like that on hardwood end grain and get nice clean shavings. And what about for hand planes? How do we know they're sharp? Well, we take them to a block of wood and we get those Instagram lovely shavings, right? The wispier the better. That's how you know it's truly sharp. No, just because you're getting these delicate shavings that look perfect for your Instagram photos doesn't mean that you're actually getting it sharp at all. Who cares what the shavings look like in the context of a plane? It's actually what the surface left behind looks like. You can have a huge pile of gorgeous shavings, but if the surface of the material is garbage, what's the point? So hopefully the takeaway from that is sharp is important, but the true meaning of sharpness is the friends that were sharpened along the way. So hopefully the takeaway from that is sharp is important, but how you get there really doesn't matter. Whatever works for you is the best method. This video is more about demystifying some of the BS going around for sharpening, but not all that educational on how to sharpen. If there is a demand for a video on how to sharpen, let me know what tools you want to see sharpened, and I'll get on to making a video on that. Thanks for watching.